Hello everyone, I am Matt. This is Golnara.
Hi.
We're from TVHE. We're going to have a little chat about an idea that's in the post there that you're probably reading when you come to this. And it's so I can practice lecturing to my university students. So, let's go and have a look at the post. The idea we were discussing was Golnara wanting to go shopping. Okay, and when we were looking at that idea, we noticed that when we look at the shop she wants to go to, they tend to be quite close together. Now, there's nothing in her preferences that suggests they should be next to each other, so why do these firms decide to locate next to each other? Now, at first brush, this seems really unintuitive. If firms could position themselves in very different places, or similarly by selling very different goods, then they should be able to get some type of monopoly power and they'll be able to extract some rent from us. So we're going to start with an example that gets rid of that attribute and focuses on their locational choice. Once we can think about just their locational choice, we can figure out why they might have an incentive or a tendency to locate next to each other. So this is a simplifying model that should help us understand that insight. Now, the bloke that came up with this model is called Hotelling. When we look at this, we're going to take this line segment here and we're going to say this is a beach or this is a street. There are customers distributed across that line evenly. So if you position yourself at the midpoint, there is a customer there, then there is the same number of customers to your left as there is to your right. If you position at 0, all the customers are to your right. If you position at 1, they're all to your left. Now, we could also do the model where all the customers are at 0 or 1 and they decide to travel inside, but we're not going to look at that part here. We're just going to keep the idea that there are these customers evenly distributed along the line. So often when we think about this idea, we'll talk about the idea of a beach. You have a beach and you have people sunbathing. They want to appropriately socially distance from each other, both because it's inappropriate and maybe we're concerned about this pandemic, and so they'll space out from each other. If we have a whole lot of single people all on the beach, they'll all space out nice and evenly for us. Now, we're going to look at the case where there are two potential ice cream vendors. So we have all these people on the lovely beach and it's warm and they would quite like an ice cream. They have some willingness to pay for an ice cream. They are making a decision about where to buy from. Now, the ice cream vendors we're going to talk about actually sell exactly the same ice cream. So there's no reason in terms of the consumer's preferences why they would go to either A or B. They're indifferent between them, given everything else. What does differ is their location. So if they are closer to A than to B, they don't have to walk as far from their spot and walk as far to get back. As a result, there is a lower transportation cost associated with going to A rather than to B. So, we're looking at a situation where the firms A and B sell the same product, say a vanilla ice cream, for exactly the same price, with fixed marginal cost. In this case, they may sell for the same price because this is actually a franchise. So we take a franchise that sells ice creams and they've given 2 licenses to ice cream sellers on this beach. They sell for the recommended retail price and they buy the ice cream for the same price from the wholesaler. As a result, we get a situation where they do not choose their price and their marginal cost is fixed, so they'll always make a margin on each unit and they'll be willing to sell. And all we're interested in is how they can turn around and decide where to locate so that they maximize their profit. So take an example of a consumer that's located here at X. They'll want to decide where to go, and when making that decision, they'll evaluate how far it is to walk to A and how far it is to walk to B. Seeing that it's shorter to walk to A, this particular consumer will want to go and shop at location A. Now, we can look all across this line at all the different locations X. There's a location directly in between where A and B are located, where the consumer will be indifferent. It's just as far to get to A as to get to B. It is the same price for the ice cream. It's exactly the same ice cream. There's no brand value. there's no difference in flavor. And as a result, our consumer will say, okay, I will decide to go to one of these places based on a coin toss. Everyone to the left of that will go to A, everyone to the right of that will go to B. If we then go to the left of A, everyone will go to A because it's always further to go to B. If we go to the right of B, everyone will decide to go to B because that is closer than going to A. So we can see here that their location determines which customers they get. However, the location of the other firm determines what customers they get as well. Now, something we've simplified away from is what happens if the transportation cost is greater than the value the consumer gets. In that case, they won't want to buy from either of them. That's an interesting addition to add in, but right now we're going to assume that even if firm A located on the very left-hand side and there was no firm B, the customer on the very right-hand side would still be willing to make the trip to buy the ice cream. As a result, we are thinking solely about the case where all these customers will be satisfied and they'll be willing to buy ice creams, and A and B are only thinking about how they split up this fixed customer base. Now what we can do here is take an example where firms A and B are at the extremes. Given they're at the extremes, each of these firms wants to make a decision about where to locate contingent on where the other firm is. So they've come in the morning. Firm A happens to live on that side of the beach and is parked there. Firm B has driven over to the opposite side of the beach and parked there. It is costless for them to just move their ice cream stand, okay? They're out there enjoying themselves on the day and they can wheel it wherever they want. So firm A will make a decision based on where firm B is located. What will that be? Okay. Now, they're currently receiving the consumer that is right in front of them and the consumer that's right next to that, all the way until the midpoint, which we've located with that line in the middle. Firm B, on the other hand, receives the consumers to the left of them all the way until the midpoint as well. So both of them are receiving half of the customers. As they're making a fixed margin on each customer, we know that they're making an amount of profit that's represented by the number of customers they have. Their sole incentive here is to maximize the number of customers. Given that, how could firm A move to increase its number of customers? Now, if firm A moved to the midpoint, they would receive all the customers to the left of them and half of the customers between them and firm B. So that would definitely increase it. So they have an incentive to move towards the midpoint. Now, what happens if they move to the midpoint between A and B, and then the midpoint from where they have moved? So they move 3/4 of the way across the line. In that case, they receive 3/4 of the customers plus half of the remaining quarter. Every time they move closer to B, they receive an extra half customer. So we know they'll have the incentive to go and shunt right next to firm B. In this case, they locate directly next to the other firm in order to maximize the number of customers they get. So think about what the customers are doing here. Every customer from the 0 point all the way up to A is making a decision about where to go. And they know it's ever so slightly more expensive to go to B, and so they go to A. Now you can start throwing things in here. What happens if some customers just naturally preferred B? Well, they'd be willing to take on that slightly higher transportation cost, so there becomes a trade-off. But here the two are exactly the same. The fact that we have a slightly smaller transportation cost means that everyone goes into A. Now, what about queues? If there was a queue, people might then spill over into B instead. So thinking about capacity and all those sorts of things becomes relevant as well. But we're assuming that each of these ice cream retailers can just serve everyone instantaneously as well. So A's incentive in this artificial situation is to locate right next to B. Now this isn't just a game being played by one of the firms, it's being played by both. So B is making a decision about where to locate, conditional on where A has located itself. So what does B do? B just pops the other side of A. Okay. If B just goes to the other side, yes, they lose the customer that they were getting by being at that one point. That now goes to A. But they gain all of these customers to the left of A. Okay. So as a result, A loses all those customers due to B's choice to relocate. And B has the incentive to do that. Now what does A do? A decides to jump over B, etc., etc. Each time they have a best response, which is to locate on the other side of their rival. When does this stop? Once they've reached the situation where they're both located in the middle of the beach, they no longer have an incentive to jump over each other. So what's happening here? When we're in the middle, if A decides to jump over B, it is sacrificing 1/2 of the line, and it receives customers that are less than a half. As a result, even though it does receive those customers, it ends up sacrificing more customers to do it. So it stays put. And B has the same incentive. Because neither of them have an incentive to change their actions, this is our equilibrium. So given this type of occurrence, these two firms want to locate together in the middle of the beach. Now if we compare that to the situation we had earlier, where they didn't move at all and they just sat there doing what they were doing when they first arrived in the morning, they both had half the customers then as well. So if there was just a very small cost associated with shifting and they were both rational actors, they would both end up in the middle, knowing that if they didn't respond, the other firm would just jump in front of them like this. They would both end up in the middle, and they would have both undertaken a cost to do that and to end up with the same profit. As a result, we have a coordination game for these two firms. They locate together even though there was an incentive for them to not change where they were located in the first place. So what Hotelling's law is telling us here is that there is some underlying incentive that firms have to locate next to each other. Now this isn't just in terms of location, but in terms of variety, the types of things they sell. We know that there is this incentive to differentiate yourself if you could earn a higher price. But if all it did was change the types of consumers you could attract, instead there's an incentive to be similar to each other. We see this with McDonald's and Burger King. They'll locate similar in terms of their location. They will make similar types of burgers, and then they'll invest heavily in branding so that they can differentiate how people perceive those burgers. Okay. So we end up with these two different types of effects that can play into each other. Now a lot of that becomes clearer when we turn around and do the maths, but we're not doing that right now. So I'll leave that there.